The fire had started in the far wing of the Holloway home, but by the time the neighbors saw the smoke curling against the autumn sky, it was already too late. Those who came running found the structure engulfed, the dried timbers snapping like brittle bones in the heat. Inside, somewhere beyond the roaring, were the Holloway brothers, Liam and Aidan, born as one body and two minds, joined at the shoulder and neck, inseparable in the eyes of both the church and the law. Dr. Nathaniel Greaves would later write in his private notes that the sound of the flames was nothing compared to the silence that followed. One half of the life before me was still, the other clung to breath as if refusing the verdict of the fire. The townsfolk had never seen anything like it. To them, the Holloways had always been a curiosity. Something whispered about but tolerated, a living proof that the Almighty's works could be both wondrous and strange. That night, however, the whispers turned darker. Liam's head lay pressed against Aidan's in the soot and ash, but only Liam's eyes moved, darting toward the doorway as if begging for the world beyond the burning walls. Aidan's side was slack, heavy, without the faintest flicker of awareness. When Dr. Greaves knelt beside them, he understood. One mind had stilled forever, while the other remained tethered to a body that was now half a tomb. In the days that followed, Brackenridge was seized by two fears: the fear of death and the fear of what it meant to take a knife to such a body. Surgery of this nature was rare even in the great cities. Here, it was closer to forbidden magic. Yet Greaves argued for it, cloaking his reasoning in the language of necessity. "If we do not act," he told the town elders, "the living part will soon follow the other." They gathered in the dim back room of the apothecary, away from the eyes of the congregation. Candles cast trembling shadows over the walls as the decision was made. There would be a separation, a removal of what the world had already taken, as Greaves phrased it. No one spoke the harsher words. The procedure took place before dawn, with the windows shuttered against both the chill and the curiosity of the townsfolk. Greaves worked slowly, his hands steady but his mind filled with the weight of what he was doing. Witnesses would later say that Liam's eyes were open the entire time, staring at the ceiling beams as though he were watching something beyond them. When it was over, the room was still, save for the faint, persistent breath of the one who had survived. Liam awoke 2 days later, pale but conscious. Yet there was something in him, an absence and a presence at once. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice sometimes carried a strange cadence, as if another rhythm had found its way into his speech. Some swore they saw his gaze flicker to an unseen companion at his side. Dr. Greaves recorded every detail, both for his own understanding and for the day when others might read and learn. But privately, he admitted in the margins of his journal that he could not shake the feeling that the boy had brought something back with him from the place where his brother had gone. Whether it was memory, guilt, or something unnameable, he could not yet say. But privately, he admitted in the margins of his journal that he could not shake the feeling that the boy had brought something back with him from the place where his brother had gone. Dr. Greaves had written those words late at night by the dim oil lamp in his study, and in the days that followed, he found himself reading them over and over. It was as if, in committing the thought to paper, he had opened a door he could not close. He began to watch Liam more closely, not only in the moments of quiet recovery, but in the subtle changes that came when the boy thought no one was looking. Liam no longer slept like other children. Some nights, he sat upright in bed for hours, his gaze fixed on a point in the corner of the room. When Greaves would ask what he saw, Liam's answers were evasive, sometimes a shrug, other times a murmured, "Nothing." But the physician noted the way Liam's eyes would shift as if tracking a presence invisible to everyone else. The townspeople too began to notice. Mrs. Avery, who ran the bakery, swore she heard Liam speaking softly to himself when he walked past her shop at dawn. Mr. Hollister, the blacksmith, claimed he saw the boy hesitate at an empty street corner, turn and nod to someone who wasn't there. In a community like Brackenridge, where whispers traveled faster than truth, These accounts quickly wove themselves into a story of a boy who was no longer entirely alone in his own body. Greaves tried to temper the rumors, reminding people of the trauma Liam had endured. But in private, he tested his own theories. Once, he placed an unfamiliar object on the table, a small tarnished locket he'd kept in his desk. Without being told, Liam picked it up and said, "It's warm," though it had been sitting in a cold room all night. When asked how he knew, Liam only smiled faintly and set it back down. The physician began recording not only Liam's physical recovery, but his peculiar reactions to certain sounds and smells. A crackling fire in the hearth would cause him to tense, yet he would not look away. The scent of burning pine seemed to draw his attention in ways Greaves could not explain. And once, when thunder rolled over the hills, Liam murmured a name, Aiden's name, so softly that Greaves almost convinced himself he hadn't heard it. One evening, the boy asked a question that unsettled the doctor more than anything else. "If a person's voice stays here," Liam said, tapping his temple, "does that mean they haven't really left?" Greaves, who had heard similar questions from patients in the throes of grief, answered carefully, "It may mean you remember them very well." Liam nodded, but his expression suggested the answer had missed the mark entirely. It was Mrs. Avery again who brought the next piece of unease. She arrived at Greaves' door, pale and shaken, insisting that she had seen Liam standing by the riverbank before dawn, speaking in a tone too deep to belong to a boy his age. "It wasn't his voice, Doctor," she said. "It was older." Greaves assured her it was likely her imagination, but the certainty in her eyes troubled him. That night, the doctor found Liam awake, staring at the darkened window. When asked what he was doing, the boy said, "Listening." Greaves pressed him to explain, but Liam only smiled that same faint, knowing smile. It was then that the physician understood he was no longer charting the recovery of a patient. He was witnessing the slow unfolding of something he could neither diagnose nor cure. Dr. Greaves carried that realization with him like a stone in his coat pocket, heavy, always present, occasionally sharp enough to cut. He began keeping a separate notebook, apart from the official medical record, where his entries drifted beyond symptoms and measurements into the territory of speculation, observation, and, reluctantly, fear. The entries from late October described changes in Liam's habits. The boy had taken to walking the outskirts of Brackenridge at strange hours, moving through the fog-laden fields as though following a trail only he could see. Greaves once shadowed him in the early hours, careful to keep his distance, and swore he saw Liam pause at the twisted remains of the Holloway house. The charred timbers were blackened against the moonlight, and for a moment, Liam reached toward them, palm open, as if expecting a hand to meet his. Midway through his return to the boarding house, the boy turned suddenly, looking directly into the darkness where Greaves stood. It was not suspicion in his eyes, but recognition, an unsettling certainty that told the physician he had been seen long before he was close enough to be heard. Rumors now spread in sharper tones. The blacksmith whispered of tools going missing from his shed, only to reappear in places no one had reason to enter. The parish clerk claimed he saw Liam at the old cemetery, tracing the weather-worn letters on headstones that bore no relation to the Holloway family. When asked, Liam said simply, "I'm learning their names." One night, the doctor decided to test a theory that had been gnawing at him. He asked Liam to sit in his study. The lamps dimmed and placed a series of objects on the table: a copper key, a wool glove, a book of hymns, and finally, a scorched fragment of wood taken from the ruins of the Holloway home. Liam's hands hovered over each item, indifferent, until they reached the blackened wood. Then his breathing slowed, his eyes unfocused, and he whispered something so faint Greaves had to lean in to catch it. "It smells like him." The doctor's pulse quickened. He had said nothing about where the fragment had come from, nor that it was found near the place where Aiden's head had lain that night. "Who smells like him, Liam?" Greaves asked. The boy blinked as if waking and replied, "The one who walks with me now." That phrase, "walks with me now," settled deep into the physician's mind. It was not the past tense of memory, nor the wistful longing of grief. It was present, active, and unyielding. Within a week, an incident forced Greaves to confront the possibility that Liam's changes were no longer confined to the private sphere. The boy was seen near the mill, where the wheel had inexplicably jammed. Workers later discovered that one of the supporting beams had been wedged with a stone from the riverbank, a place miles away. No one could say how it had gotten there, but one witness swore she saw Liam leave the scene, his clothes damp as though he'd been standing in the river itself. Greaves tried to speak with him that evening, but Liam met every question with silence, only breaking it to say, "Sometimes he's stronger than me." The physician found himself without an answer, for he no longer knew if he was speaking to the boy who had survived, or the presence that had returned with him. In the days that followed, Dr. Greaves could not shake the impression that his conversations with Liam were no longer truly dialogues. It was as though his words were being sifted, weighed, and answered only when the presence, if such a thing existed, allowed it. Sometimes Liam's tone was light, almost playful. Other times it held a measured gravity that seemed far too old for a boy of his years. The real turning point came late in November. The town was quiet under a pale frost, the sky the color of iron. Greaves had taken to visiting Liam unannounced, believing that surprise might reveal patterns otherwise hidden. On this morning, he found the boy seated on the floor by the hearth, his fingers weaving strands of coarse twine into intricate knots. At first, it seemed nothing more than idle craft, until the doctor recognized the pattern. It was identical to the knot used on the mill's support beam when it had been jammed. "Who taught you that?" Greaves asked. Liam looked up slowly, his eyes unreadable. "I've always known," he said. "I just couldn't remember until now." That statement struck the physician as more troubling than any outright denial could have been. Later, Greaves tested the boy again, this time with conversation designed to prod without accusation. "Some knowledge comes from experience," he said, "and some from instruction. Which is this?" Liam tied another knot, glanced toward the empty corner of the room, and replied, "Instruction." The implication was unmistakable. Someone or something was still guiding him. By early December, incidents had multiplied. A horse in the stables was found unlatched and wandering before dawn. A weather vane atop the chapel had been turned completely backward, despite the height making it nearly unreachable without equipment. Each time, no proof tied Liam to the event, yet each occurrence seemed to echo his strange new habits. Knots, precise placements, deliberate inversions. Greaves's private notes grew darker. He began charting what he called the progression, marking each incident alongside the changes in Liam's demeanor. The boy's silences became longer, his smiles rarer, but when they came, they carried the same faint curve as before, tinged with something that felt like recognition, as though he knew more about the doctor than the doctor knew about himself. One evening, after a long stretch of quiet, Liam spoke abruptly. "Aiden doesn't like the cold," he said. Greaves, taken off guard, asked if he still felt his brother near. "Not near," Liam corrected. "Here." He tapped his chest once, then the side of his head. "Sometimes he wants things I don't." That admission was not just unsettling, it was dangerous. If Liam believed, or truly experienced, that his brother's will could overtake his own, the boundary between the boy and whatever else lingered was fraying. The physician considered contacting a colleague in Louisville, someone versed in the more obscure corners of mental disturbance, but he hesitated. Outsiders would not understand the delicacy of the case, nor the small-town suspicion that already hung over the Holloway name. His hesitation proved costly. The following week, Mrs. Avery arrived again, visibly shaken. She claimed she'd awoken before dawn to see Liam standing in the frost-covered street, bare feet unmoved against the ice, his head tilted as though listening. She swore she heard 2 distinct breaths out of sync in the still air. When Greaves confronted him later that day, Liam only said, "It's easier for him at night." That single sentence confirmed the physician's fear. There was now an he in their conversations, separate from Liam, and whatever he wanted was no longer hiding. Dr. Greaves could not unhear those words. They followed him through his rounds at the infirmary, into his meals, even into the quiet of his study where the lamp's flame trembled with every draught. He began to view Liam less as a boy in recovery and more as a conduit, something through which another might pass. Whether that will belong to the memory of Aidan or to something else entirely, Greaves dared not yet conclude. It was during this tense period that a new pattern emerged. Objects from different households began to vanish. Small things at first, a brass button from the tailor's counter, a pair of knitting needles from Mrs. Avery's workbench, a child's toy boat from the riverside. No one saw Liam take them, but weeks later, Greaves discovered all 3 among Liam's belongings, tucked neatly inside a wooden box under his bed. When asked about the items, Liam simply said, "They're for later," and refused to elaborate. The doctor noted that his tone had changed, less defensive than one might expect from a boy accused, more like someone guarding a secret that wasn't entirely his own. Greaves began mapping these disappearances against the other incidents. He noticed an unsettling correlation. Each object had a connection to water. The toy boat was obvious, but the knitting needles had been stored near the river-facing window of Mrs. Avery's shop, and the brass button belonged to a coat worn on the ferry crossing. It was as if the he Liam spoke of had an agenda linked to the river itself. This fixation came to a head when the miller's daughter claimed she saw Liam down at the water's edge, crouching over something in the shallows. She described his posture as careful, like he was building something. When she called out, Liam looked up, not startled, but almost annoyed, and then walked into the deeper mist until he vanished from her sight. Greaves decided he could no longer rely on observation alone. One night, he followed Liam directly, keeping close enough to see without being seen. The boy's steps were deliberate, leading to the same bend in the river where the charred remains of the Holloway house's rafters had been carried downstream months earlier. There, Liam knelt and began arranging stones in a crescent shape. It was not random. The doctor recognized the configuration from old maritime charts, an anchoring pattern used to hold a vessel steady in shifting currents. How would a boy from Brackenridge, with no seafaring experience, know such a thing? Greaves' pulse quickened as Liam placed the final stone and whispered something into the fog. The words were swallowed by the river, but the doctor could have sworn he heard 2 voices overlap for the briefest instant. The following day, he confronted Liam in his study. "You're building something, aren't you? Down by the water?" The boy's lips curled faintly. "We're preparing," he said. Greaves pressed for more, but Liam only added, "He says the river remembers, and it will give back what it took." That was the moment Greaves realized he was no longer a step ahead in this strange unfolding. He was already behind, and whatever he intended was moving toward its next stage. The idea that something had been set in motion without his full awareness weighed heavily on Dr. Greaves. It was no longer about curious behaviors or the speculative notion of a lingering spirit. This was now a process, deliberate and advancing, whether anyone believed it or not. Greaves began to notice that Liam's interactions with the townspeople had shifted. He no longer avoided crowds as he once did after the fire. Instead, he walked among them with a calm assurance, pausing at the market stalls, occasionally asking strange, pointed questions. "How deep is the river this season?" he inquired of the ferryman. "Do you think it remembers the storms?" The ferryman, unsettled, later told Greaves it was the way he asked, like he wasn't asking me at all. One afternoon, Greaves decided to test a theory. He visited Liam with a map of the river, laying it on the table between them. If you were to send something down this river and wanted it to come back, where would it have to start? The boy didn't hesitate. He tapped a finger on a sharp bend just north of the old Holloway property. "Here," he said, and then added softly, "He says that's where the gate is." The term gate caught Greaves' attention. It was not a word the boy had used before. When pressed, Liam explained no further, only remarking that the gate had to be opened properly, or it will take more than it gives back. This was when the doctor's notes took on a new urgency. He began recording exact dates, weather conditions, and lunar phases alongside each incident involving Liam. A pattern emerged, most events clustered near the full moon or during heavy fog. The idea seemed absurdly folkloric for a man of science, yet the consistency was undeniable. In mid-December, Greaves observed something that unsettled him more than any whispered confession. While visiting the chapel at dusk, he saw Liam standing at the altar rail, hands resting on the wood as though in prayer. Across from him, on the other side of the chancel, the tall brass candlestick swayed ever so slightly, though there was no draught. The boy's gaze was fixed on it, and Greaves could swear the motion matched the rhythm of his slow, steady breathing. Later that week, the physician attempted a more direct challenge. "Liam," he began, "if Aiden is here, why doesn't he speak to me?" The boy's reply was flat. "He doesn't like you. You keep trying to close the door." That night, unable to sleep, Greaves reviewed his earliest notes after the fire. The progression was undeniable. First the silences, then the subtle mimicry of skills Liam could not have learned, then the coordinated incidents around town. Now, with the mention of a gate and the river's role, the picture was taking shape into something more dangerous. A plan with steps, each one executed with quiet precision. 2 days before Christmas, Mrs. Avery brought news that chilled him. She had seen Liam on the riverbank again, this time with another boy from town. Both stood in the shallows, arranging stones in that same crescent formation. When she called to them, the other boy turned toward her, his expression blank, eyes glassy. "Liam," she said, did not turn at all. Greaves knew then that whatever was happening was no longer confined to Liam alone. It was spreading. The realization unsettled him far more than the earlier signs of possession or influence. A single boy could be monitored, questioned, even restrained if it came to that. But something that spread, quietly, invisibly, through others was a different threat entirely. The physician's role shifted from observer to reluctant guardian of a community that didn't even know it was at risk. His next step was to verify what Mrs. Avery had reported. That meant speaking to the other boy, the miller's son, Thomas. At first, Thomas avoided answering, fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve, glancing toward the doorway as if afraid someone else might overhear. When pressed, he admitted that Liam had taken him to the river to show him something important. What had he seen? "Just rocks," the boy said. "But when we put them like he said, the water moved different. It made a sound like someone breathing." Greaves noted the description in his journal, underlining it twice. This wasn't imagination. The imagery matched too closely to Liam's earlier comments about him breathing at night. The physician began to suspect that the stone patterns were not random arrangements, but part of a larger, deliberate design, possibly even a map. Determined to gather evidence, Greaves went to the riverbank alone the following night. The fog lay heavy, and the moon was only a thin blade in the sky. He found the crescent of stones exactly as described, though some had shifted as if by unseen hands. Crouching down, he traced their outline and realized the formation pointed upstream, directly toward the bend Liam had identified on the map as the gate. That same night, he found Liam in the boarding house's kitchen, calmly eating bread as though nothing had happened. "Thomas won't be coming with me again," the boy said without being prompted. "He's not ready." The casual tone sent a cold pulse through the doctor's spine. Liam was speaking like someone conducting an initiation. The next morning brought another troubling report. The blacksmith's daughter had been found sleepwalking along the river, her bare feet coated in mud and small cuts from the stones. She remembered nothing, only that she dreamt of a voice calling her name from the water. Greaves could no longer dismiss this as coincidence. Liam's influence, or his influence, was now reaching beyond deliberate encounters, seeping into the subconscious of others. Midway through January, Greaves decided to take a risk. He followed Liam in daylight, pretending it was a casual walk, and steered their path toward the North Bend. To his surprise, the boy did not resist. When they reached the curve in the river, Liam stopped and looked directly at the water. "This is where it began," he said softly. Greaves asked what he meant. "Before the fire," Liam replied. "Before we were even born, he made a promise here. Now he's collecting." The physician's pulse quickened. "Collecting what?" he demanded. Liam turned, and for a moment, Greaves thought he saw something shift behind the boy's eyes. An echo, a shadow, something that did not belong to a child's gaze. "Not what?" Liam said. "Who?" It was in that moment Greaves understood that the gate Liam spoke of was not a place for things to pass. It was a threshold for people, and it was opening. Dr. Greaves carried those words back with him through the cold, silent streets of Brackenridge, feeling as though every shadow was a herald of what Liam had described. He could no longer dismiss the events as isolated or even as products of grief. This was a process, a deliberate unfolding that seemed bound to the river, to the town, and to something far older than the Holloway tragedy. He resolved to confront Liam in a setting where the boy could not simply drift away into the fog or evade with a half-smile. The following evening, Greaves invited him into his study, shutting the door and placing himself between Liam and the exit. The fire snapped in the grate, casting the boy's features in a shifting orange glow. "You said the gate is opening," Greaves began. "If that's true, I need to know what it leads to." Liam leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the doctor as if measuring the weight of his sincerity. "You wouldn't believe me," he said. "Try me." For a moment, the boy's expression softened, almost pitying. "It's not a place you go to," he murmured. "It's a place that comes here, piece by piece." He gestured vaguely toward the window, where beyond the frosted glass, the river whispered in the night. The physician felt an involuntary shiver. "And who opens it?" Liam's gaze sharpened. "He does, but he needs hands, eyes, a voice people will listen to." Greaves understood the implication. Liam was not merely a passive witness. He was a participant, perhaps even the primary instrument. Yet the boy did not seem afraid of this role. If anything, there was a sense of belonging in his tone, as though being chosen carried its own form of comfort. The doctor changed tactics. "If he needs a voice, then he chose poorly. I can speak louder." It was a bluff, but Liam tilted his head, curious. "You think he hasn't thought of you?" That remark lodged deep. Was the influence that had overtaken Liam now probing others? The thought of his own mind being compromised made Greaves' throat tighten. He decided then that waiting for authorities or outside help was no longer an option. If the gate was truly opening, it had to be closed before more of Brackenridge was drawn in. But the problem was proof. The elders of the town would not act on whispers and half-glimpsed events, and Liam, with his youth and quiet demeanor, could still be dismissed as an unfortunate orphan caught in the aftershock of tragedy. 2 days later, an opportunity came. Greaves was awakened before dawn by urgent knocking. Mr. Hollister, the blacksmith, had found a series of markings carved into the frozen mud along the riverbank. They were arranged in deliberate rows, some resembling crude figures, others more like symbols. Greaves recognized one instantly. It was the same pattern Liam had traced absent-mindedly in his ledger weeks earlier. By the time they returned to the site, the markings had been partially washed away, but the impression was clear, and there, at the far end of the row, was a new symbol, an open circle with a line descending from its center into a jagged curve, pointing toward the bend in the river. Liam, when confronted, didn't deny it. "It's the last step," he said plainly. "Once it's done, he can come through all at once." The doctor realized with a surge of dread that time was almost gone. The gate was not merely opening, it was nearly open. That thought became the drumbeat behind every waking moment for Dr. Greaves. He could feel it in the air, like the charged stillness before a storm. The townspeople went about their winter routines, unaware that the boy they greeted politely on the street might be building the final key to something none of them could understand, let alone stop. Greaves knew he needed an ally, someone who would believe him without the burden of official proof. He thought first of Mr. Hollister, whose discovery of the riverbank symbols had been no accident. Hollister was a practical man, not given to superstition, yet the sight of those carvings had shaken him. When Greaves spoke to him privately, the blacksmith's eyes narrowed. "If you're saying the boy's dangerous, then I'll do what needs doing, but you'd better be sure, Doctor." They decided on a simple plan. Follow Liam without his knowledge, observe, and document everything. If they could see the last step with their own eyes, they might intervene before it was too late. It didn't take long for the opportunity to present itself. On the third night, Hollister spotted Liam slipping out of the boarding house, a bundle under his arm. The two men followed at a distance, the frost crunching under their boots, careful not to let their breath carry in the still air. Liam led them down the familiar path to the river bend, the place he'd called the gate. There, by the faint light of a half-moon, the boy knelt and began removing objects from the bundle. The brass button, the knitting needles, the toy boat, and several smooth stones etched with the same symbols seen in the mud. He placed them one by one into the water, arranging them in a slow, deliberate pattern. It was then that Greaves noticed something else. A thin, wavering distortion above the water, like heat rising from a summer road. It shimmered faintly, and though the air was freezing, he could swear he felt a warm pulse on his face. Hollister muttered a curse and gripped the doctor's arm. "Do you see that?" Before Greaves could answer, Liam spoke. Not to them, but to the water. His words were low, rhythmic, in a cadence neither man recognized. The shimmer above the river grew, and from within it came a sound. Faint, distant, like the rush of air in a deep cavern. Hollister moved forward, but Greaves caught his sleeve. They couldn't act blindly. They needed to know what was on the other side of this threshold before they risked stopping it. Yet as they hesitated, Liam turned his head slightly, a faint smile crossing his face. "He knows you're here," he said without looking directly at them. The distortion over the water swelled, and for an instant, Greaves thought he saw shapes moving within it. Shapes that were almost human, but wrong in proportion, bending at angles no living thing could manage. Hollister's grip on his arm tightened. "We end it now," he whispered. But before they could move, Liam's voice changed. Deeper, resonant, layered with something that was not his own. "Too late," it said. In that moment, Greaves understood that stopping the ritual now might not be enough. The gate was not simply waiting to be opened, it was already pushing through. Greaves felt those words settle in his chest like ice. He had been wrong from the start, wrong to think the gate was a passive thing, waiting for permission. It had been pressing forward all along, using Liam as its lever, the river as its hinge. Now, with the shimmer widening and the air thickening like breath on glass, the physician understood they were standing at the brink of something irreversible. Hollister didn't wait for more signs. He lunged forward, kicking through the arrangement of stones in the water. The shimmer flickered, rippling as though in protest. Liam's head snapped up, and for a moment his eyes were not his own. Too dark, too deep, reflecting nothing of the world around them. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice carrying both the light tenor of a boy and the resonant undertone of something vast. The river responded. The current, which had been sluggish under winter's chill, surged violently, splashing over the bank and soaking Greaves to the knees. The doctor grabbed Hollister's arm, hauling him back before the ground beneath them gave way. But Liam did not move. He stood in the water as though rooted to the riverbed, the swell rising around him without knocking him from balance. "Liam!" Greaves called, but the boy's gaze was fixed somewhere beyond them. "He's here," Liam whispered. "He's closer than you think." Greaves knew they couldn't overpower him by force, not when whatever shared that body had strength neither man could measure. Instead, he tried the only weapon he had left: knowledge. "If he's truly here," the doctor said, stepping forward, "then he doesn't need you anymore. You'll be nothing when he crosses through." For a fleeting second, something in Liam's eyes shifted, a flicker of uncertainty. Hollister seized the moment, pulling a length of iron chain from his coat pocket. In one motion, he looped it around the boy's waist and hauled him from the water. Liam fought, but not with his full strength. Greaves could feel the struggle was divided, as though two wills inside him were contending for control. Once they had him on the bank, Hollister pinned him while Greaves scattered the remaining stones and swept the carved objects into a sack. The shimmer above the river pulsed once, then thinned, receding like a tide. The unnatural warmth in the air faded, replaced by the honest, biting cold of winter. But Liam lay still, eyes closed, breath shallow. For an awful moment, Greaves feared they had lost him entirely. Then the boy's lips parted, and in a voice that was entirely his own, fragile, human, and trembling, he whispered, "He's not gone. He's just waiting." Greaves knew it was not a victory, only a reprieve. The gate, though forced back, remained. And if it could push forward once, it could do so again. That night, Greaves secured Liam in the small upstairs room of the boarding house, locking the door from the outside. It was not cruelty, it was containment. He stationed Hollister at the stairwell with instructions not to let anyone, under any circumstances, enter. Still, as he wrote in his private journal before dawn, the doctor admitted the truth he could no longer ignore. "We are not closing the gate. We are only holding it shut with our hands, and our hands will not hold forever." Greaves reread that line in his journal by the dim lamplight, the ink still glistening wet. It wasn't exaggeration. It was the plainest truth he'd ever written. He could feel it in his bones, in the unsettled silence that lingered in the boarding house, despite Hollister's watch at the stairs. The boy was contained, but the presence inside him wasn't. The first night after the river incident passed without event, though Greaves swore he heard faint tapping from upstairs. Not frantic, not random, measured, deliberate, like someone keeping count. By the second night, the tapping was joined by a low hum. Hollister claimed he didn't hear it, but Greaves knew the man was lying to keep his own nerves steady. On the third night, the doctor brought food to Liam's room. He found the boy sitting on the floor, knees drawn to his chest, head tilted in the way that had always signaled he was listening. "Who's speaking to you?" Greaves asked, keeping his voice calm. Liam looked up slowly, and for the briefest instant, the doctor thought the boy's face was older, sharper, an echo of the features Aidan might have worn had he lived longer. "He's not speaking to me," Liam replied. "He's speaking to you." Greaves froze. "What is he saying?" "That you can't keep me here, and that when he comes again, you'll be the first to see." The boy's tone was matter-of-fact, almost kind, as though relaying the message was an act of courtesy. The rest of the day passed in taut silence, but that night, Hollister shook the doctor awake. Someone had been outside, scratching at the boarding house door. The blacksmith had chased them off into the fog, but he swore the intruder had been barefoot despite the frost. They left behind a trail of prints, small, but not small enough to be a child's. The implications settled in Greaves' mind like a spreading stain. If the presence could reach others, even while Liam was confined, then the boy was not the gate's only tether. It had found another way in. The next morning, Greaves tried to press Liam for details, but the boy only smiled faintly. "You think you're keeping him out," he said, "but you're keeping him in with you." That remark stayed with Greaves long after he left the room. The inversion of the threat, the possibility that containment might be exactly what the presence wanted, forced him to reconsider his approach entirely. Was the locked room a barrier or a vessel? By week's end, strange events multiplied. The boarding house cat was found curled in front of Liam's door, its fur wet as though it had been pulled from the river. A local farmer reported hearing two voices singing in harmony on the road outside his barn at midnight, both matching Liam's tone. And Hollister, once so sure in his role, admitted he'd begun dreaming of the river bend, waking with his hands clenched as though holding stones. Greaves knew the line they were walking had grown perilously thin. The next move would determine whether the gate stayed wedged in place or swung wide enough for whatever waited beyond to step fully into Brackenridge. And the presence, patient as the river itself, seemed to know he had very little time left to decide. The decision weighed on Greaves like a millstone. It wasn't merely about what to do with Liam. It was about what to do with whatever else shared that small frame. Locking the boy away had been an act of desperation. Now it felt like complicity. The air in Brackenridge had changed, the same way the river's surface changes before it swallows a log. Still, silent, waiting. Greaves spent the day pacing between his study and the boarding house, replaying every interaction with Liam since the fire. There had been warning signs even before the operation, subtle moments when Aiden's presence seemed more than just physical. Now looking back, they read less like coincidence and more like inevitability. That evening, he decided to speak plainly to Hollister. "If we keep him here, we may be giving it exactly what it wants," Greaves said. The blacksmith's jaw tightened. "And if we let him go?" The unspoken answer hung between them, then the rest of the town would be next. Their debate was cut short by a sound from upstairs, a rhythmic thud, not frantic, but purposeful. They rushed to Liam's door, Hollister unlocking it with deliberate care. Inside, the boy was standing barefoot in the center of the room, tapping his heel on the floorboards in a slow, steady beat. "What are you doing?" Greaves demanded. "Counting," Liam said softly. "He's nearly here." Before the doctor could respond, the room seemed to shift. The air grew dense, the shadows deepened, and the faint sound of moving water filled his ears, though the nearest stream was blocks away. Liam tilted his head as if listening to someone standing directly beside him. "He says you're ready now," the boy whispered. Hollister moved toward him, but Liam's arm shot out with startling force, shoving the man back into the wall. His voice, when he spoke again, was layered, the familiar timbre of the boy wrapped around something deeper, resonant and cold. "We don't need the river anymore. You brought us to shore." The lamplight flickered wildly, casting the three of them in broken flashes. Greaves felt the sensation of being watched from all angles at once, though the only eyes in the room were Liam's. Every instinct told him to run, yet something in the doctor's mind whispered that this was the moment, the thin seam between control and surrender. He stepped forward. "If you want me, take me," he said. "Leave the boy." Liam's head tilted, his lips curling in something almost like amusement. "That's not how it works." Hollister, regaining his footing, lunged again, this time catching Liam around the middle. The boy thrashed, the layered voice erupting into a sharp, guttural cry that made the window panes rattle. The air seemed to compress, then release in a sudden, violent gust that snuffed the lamp. In the darkness, Greaves reached for the door, dragging Hollister and the boy through it. They slammed it shut, locking it once more. Liam's voice called after them, not angry, not pleading, but calm. "Soon." Greaves knew the word wasn't a threat. It was a promise, and promises, he had learned, were the one thing this presence always kept. The promise hung over the following days like a veil, too thin to block the light, but heavy enough to distort it. Brackenridge seemed quieter than usual, though it wasn't the stillness of winter. It was the kind of quiet a town keeps when it knows something is coming and cannot name it. Liam was moved under Greaves' direction to a more secure location. A disused wing of the infirmary, its long corridor lined with empty rooms. The rationale was simple. Fewer people, fewer variables. Yet the building's emptiness felt less like safety and more like an invitation. Hollister stood guard at the end of the hall, armed not with weapons, but with the iron chain he'd used before, as though its weight alone could hold back whatever pressed at the edges of reality. At first, confinement seemed to dull the presence's reach. No strange footprints in the snow, no river-damp animals appearing indoors, no reports of townsfolk wandering in their sleep. But Greaves had learned to mistrust calm. He visited Liam daily, speaking in measured tones, pretending at the roles of physician and patient. The boy's demeanor was placid now, his voice quiet, his gaze unthreatening. Yet Greaves noticed subtle shifts, the way Liam's eyes tracked invisible movements along the walls, the way his fingers tapped in sequences that repeated every seventh count. On the fourth day, Greaves brought in a small mirror, setting it on the table between them. "Humor me," he said, inviting Liam to look into it. The boy stared for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "He's not in there right now," he said, "but he can see you through mine." That night, the first incident in days occurred. Hollister reported hearing a soft knock on the infirmary's side door just past midnight. When he opened it, no one was there, only a wet mark on the threshold, shaped not like a boot or bare foot, but like a hand, the fingers splayed wide. Greaves examined the mark himself in the morning. The water was gone, but an outline remained, faintly crusted with frost. It pointed toward Liam's room. When confronted, Liam didn't deny it. "He's practicing," the boy said, "so that when the door opens, he won't have to wait for you to let him in." Greaves felt a shiver run through him. The presence was adapting, learning new ways to bypass the barriers they'd built. Physical locks and iron chains might hold a body, but they were useless against a will that could drift like smoke through any crack. That evening, as snow fell in slow spirals outside, Greaves sat in his office trying to draft a letter to a colleague in Louisville. But every time his pen touched the paper, he heard Liam's voice in his memory. Calm, certain, soon. He tore the page in half. Whatever was coming, he no longer believed outside help could arrive in time. The answer, if there was one, would have to be found here, in this small town where the river bent like a crooked finger, pointing towards something it had promised long before Greaves had ever heard the name Holloway. The realization carried with it both urgency and a strange, fatalistic calm. Greaves felt as though he had stepped into a script written before his birth, the lines unchangeable, his role predetermined. The river's bend loomed in his mind like an instruction, not a landmark. That night, the snow stopped, and a brittle cold settled over Brackenridge. The infirmary's old windows groaned in their frames, and every sound carried farther than it should have in the thin air. Hollister kept his post at the end of the hallway, the iron chain coiled at his feet. Shortly after midnight, Greaves woke to a noise unlike any he had yet heard in this ordeal. A steady, measured dripping, as if water were falling from a great height onto a hard surface. He followed the sound to Liam's room. The boy was sitting on the floor, eyes closed, but the floorboards beneath him were wet. Greaves knelt, touching the water. It was warmer than the air. "Where is this coming from?" he asked quietly. Liam opened his eyes. "The gate doesn't need the river anymore," he said. "It's here now." The physician's mind raced. If that was true, then the rules had changed entirely. Containment was meaningless if the threshold could manifest wherever it pleased. He glanced toward the corner of the room where the shadows seemed deeper than the lamp's light could reach. That was when Hollister burst in, his face pale. "Doctor, you need to see this." He led Greaves down the hall to the infirmary's central ward. There, on the far wall, water trickled from a crack in the plaster, except it was not melting snow. It was dark, almost black, and it left no stain as it seeped down. Greaves approached, pressing his ear to the wall. From within came a sound like rushing water, but layered beneath it was something else. A chorus of low, overlapping murmurs, too distorted to make out, but undeniably human in cadence. Liam's voice carried from the end of the hall. "He's practicing. He wants you to know he's ready." The boy had left his room without either of them seeing. He stood barefoot on the cold boards, his gaze fixed on the wall as if it were a doorway already half open. Hollister moved to grab him, but Greaves held up a hand. "No," he said softly. "If this is the moment, I need to see it." Liam stepped closer to the wall. The murmurs grew louder, resolving into broken fragments of words. Some sounded like names, others like commands. The black water pulsed once, as if in response to his presence. Then Liam turned to Greaves, and for the first time, there was no trace of the boy in his expression, only the weight of something far older. "Tomorrow," he said. "He walks through tomorrow." Greaves felt the truth in the words like a hook set deep. There would be no delaying, no further preparations. The threshold would open, here in Brackenridge, and whatever lay beyond it would no longer be content to wait. Greaves awoke before dawn, though he could not say he had truly slept. The air itself seemed thinner, the silence of the infirmary pressing against his ears. He rose, lit the lamp, and found Hollister already in the hall, chain coiled in his hands like a weapon he no longer believed would matter. Neither man spoke. They both knew the shape of the day ahead. By mid-morning, a dampness had settled over the building. It was not the winter frost, nor the aftermath of snow. It was the same warmth Greaves had felt by the river bend the night the shimmer had appeared. The walls breathed faintly, their plaster darkening in slow, irregular blotches. Somewhere deep inside the building, water was moving, though there were no pipes to explain it. Liam emerged from his room without a sound, barefoot, his eyes calm. "It's time," he said. His voice was neither invitation nor command. It was simply fact. He turned down the main corridor, and the two men followed, not because they agreed, but because leaving him to walk alone felt somehow more dangerous. The black water on the ward wall now pulsed in rhythm with the boy's steps. The murmurs within had grown louder, no longer obscured. Greaves could make out names, half-formed words, and the steady, deliberate sound of breathing. Hollister muttered a prayer under his breath. Liam stopped before the wall, placing both hands flat against it. The black sheen spread outward in a slow ripple, widening into a perfect circle. Within it, shapes began to form, faint at first, then sharper. The suggestion of figures, faces pressed too close, their features blurred by movement. The air thickened, warm and damp, smelling faintly of the river in summer. "Step back," Greaves told Hollister. The blacksmith hesitated, but obeyed. Greaves moved closer, forcing his voice steady. "If you walk through, Liam, what happens to you?" The boy turned his head slightly. "He says I don't have to walk through. He says you can bring it here." The realization struck Greaves like a blow. The presence didn't need a willing vessel. It only needed an anchor, someone to pull it fully into this world. His throat tightened. "And if I refuse?" Liam's faint smile was the same as the one he'd worn on the night of the operation. "Then you'll still see it. You'll just see it last." The black circle began to bow outward, its surface straining like water under glass. Hollister gripped the chain tighter. Greaves knew they had seconds at most. With a sudden motion, he lunged forward, shoving Liam away from the wall. The boy hit the floor, the circle wavering violently, its surface rippling in jagged lines. The murmurs rose to a roar, the air pressing inward from all sides. Hollister swung the chain at the circle, the iron link striking the black surface with a sound like cracking ice. The shimmer shattered, not disappearing but collapsing inward, retreating in a single violent pull that made the walls groan. When it was over, the corridor was silent. The wall was bare plaster again, damp but solid. Liam lay still, breathing, his eyes closed. Greaves knelt, checking his pulse. It was steady, but when the boy's eyes opened, they were not the same. They were empty. The events at the Brackenridge Infirmary were never officially recorded beyond a brief note of structural water damage and patient relocation. Liam Holloway was moved to an undisclosed facility, and Hollister returned to his forge, speaking little of that winter. Greaves stayed on in Brackenridge, though his practice dwindled. In the margins of his journal, he wrote a single line, over and over. We held it shut once. We may not hold it twice. Some nights, when the river runs high and the fog rolls in thick, a faint knocking is heard on the infirmary's old walls. Those who have stood there say it comes in threes, always followed by the sound of a single breath drawn far too close. Perhaps the threshold never closed entirely. Perhaps it waits for another anchor. And if you've listened this far, tell me, if the river called your name, would you answer? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for the next story. The truth is often closer than we want it to be, and far harder to send back once it arrives.